Spring 1970. Tim Staffell quit the band, and Freddie Mercury finally got his chance to sing. The audition lasted 3 minutes. What happened in those 3 minutes would change rock and roll forever. But nobody knew that yet. Especially not Brian May and Roger Taylor, who sat in their rehearsal space, wondering if they should just give up on music entirely and get real jobs like their parents wanted. For months, they'd been watching this strange fan show up at every single Smile concert. Same spot in the audience, same intense stare, same unsettling confidence when he'd materialize backstage with suggestions about their lighting, their costumes, their stage presence. His name was Freddie Bulsara, but he'd started calling himself Freddie, and he'd been waiting for this exact moment, the moment when their singer quit and left them desperate to finally prove what he'd known all along. He could do it better. Brian and Roger had their doubts. Freddie was theatrical, sure. Opinionated, absolutely. But could he actually sing? They genuinely didn't know, and they were about to find out in the most dramatic way possible. Because when Freddie Mercury opened his mouth for the first time as Queen's singer, the shy art student who sat silently in the back of classrooms disappeared completely. In his place stood a force of nature that nobody had ever seen coming. During the day, Freddie Bulsara was invisible. His classmates at Ealing Art College barely knew he existed. He sat in the back row sketching in silence, speaking only when directly addressed, and even then his voice came out apologetic, almost guilty for taking up space. They called him the Silent Boy. What they didn't know was that when darkness fell over London, this same quiet student underwent a transformation so complete it seemed like possession. He would slip out to underground clubs and watch bands perform with the focus of someone conducting scientific research. He wasn't there to enjoy the music. He was there to dissect it, to understand the mechanics of performance, to figure out what separated magnetic performers from forgettable ones. By 1969, he'd become a ghost haunting the London music scene, and he'd found his subject of study, a band called Smile. Every night they played, there he was. Brian May and Roger Taylor started recognizing him immediately. Same dark eyes burning with something between admiration and hunger. Same position near the stage. Same refusal to blend into the crowd like a normal fan. And after every show, without fail, he'd find his way backstage. "You're brilliant," he'd say, "but you need more theatricality. The lighting is all wrong. Your outfits are boring. Let me help you." Brian and Roger would smile politely, thank him, and after he left, they'd exchange bewildered looks. Who was this exotic-looking stranger with the outrageous fashion sense telling them how to run their band? But they couldn't entirely dismiss him. His suggestions, as annoying as they were, often made disturbing sense. To understand how this quiet boy became rock's greatest frontman, you need to go back to the beginning, to a childhood that taught him how to transform pain into power. September 5, 1946. Zanzibar, a tiny island off Africa's eastern coast that most people couldn't locate on a map. Freddie Bulsara was born into a conservative Parsi family with rigid expectations. His father, Bomi, worked in British colonial administration. His mother, Jer, raised him with clear ideas about respectability. The future they envisioned for Freddie involved law, medicine, government service, stability, respectability, anything except music. But even as a small child, Freddie was drawn to sound like iron to a magnet. He'd sit transfixed by the family radio, absorbing melodies from Indian film music and Western pop songs, memorizing every note, mimicking every singer. At 8 years old, his parents made a decision that would scar him permanently. They sent him away to boarding school in India. St. Peter's School in Panchgani, thousands of miles from home, from family, from everything familiar. Imagine being 8 years old, watching your parents disappear as your ship pulls away, knowing months would pass before you'd see them again. The loneliness of those years carved something deep into Freddie's soul, a desperate need to be seen, to be valued, to matter to someone. At St. Peter's, he discovered 2 things that would define his life. First, he could sing. His music teacher noticed something special in the boy's voice and encouraged him. Second, his schoolmates gave him a nickname that would stick forever: Freddie. But boarding school also taught him cruelty. Other boys mocked his prominent teeth, the physical feature he'd be self-conscious about for the rest of his life. He learned to cover his mouth when he laughed, a habit that would last into adulthood. More importantly, though, he learned how to weaponize performance. When children mocked him, Freddie discovered he could win them over by entertaining them, singing, making them laugh, putting on little shows that transformed tormentors into audiences. It was his first taste of a power that would eventually command stadiums. In 1964, revolution swept through Zanzibar with brutal violence. The Bulsara family, like thousands of others with Indian heritage, fled for their lives. They arrived in England as refugees with almost nothing. Freddie was 17 when he landed in Feltham, a grey London suburb that couldn't have been more different from tropical Zanzibar. Cold, unwelcoming. The family struggled. His father took whatever work he could find. His mother adapted to a life without servants, and Freddie enrolled at Ealing Art College to study graphic design, which his parents saw as acceptable. Not music. Art could lead to a respectable career. But Freddie had no intention of becoming a graphic designer. He was biding his time, living a double life, waiting for his real existence to begin. By 1966, London had become the epicenter of musical revolution. The Beatles ruled the world. The Rolling Stones scandalized parents. Jimi Hendrix was redefining what guitars could do. And in small clubs across the city, hundreds of young musicians dreamed of joining that pantheon. Freddie was one of them, but with a difference. He studied performance like it was engineering. Days were spent in art classes, sketching and pretending to care about graphic design. Nights belonged to music. He'd slip into clubs like the Marquee and the Speakeasy, watching bands with scientific intensity. He started singing with small groups. First Ibex, a blues rock band based in Liverpool. Freddie would make the exhausting journey between cities whenever they had a gig. The band wasn't particularly good. They achieved nothing. But Freddie was learning, developing stage presence, experimenting with his voice, figuring out how to command attention. Ibex became Wreckage. Wreckage fell apart. Freddie briefly joined Sour Milk Sea. That failed too. Most people would have read these failures as messages from the universe to pursue something else. Freddie saw them as tuition payments for an education in performance. While Freddie was failing with forgettable bands, something significant was happening at Imperial College London. A brilliant astrophysics student named Brian May had formed a band with his friend Tim Staffell. Brian was extraordinary, a genuine genius, who would eventually earn a doctorate and become a leading expert on interplanetary dust. But in 1968, his passion was music, particularly the guitar he'd built with his father, using wood salvage from a century-old fireplace mantel. They called it the Red Special, and it produced sounds no other guitar could match. To complete Smile, Brian needed a drummer. He posted an advertisement seeking someone in the style of Mitch Mitchell or Ginger Baker. A dental student named Roger Taylor auditioned and got the job immediately. Roger was handsome, talented, and possessed a falsetto voice that could reach impossible notes. He'd abandoned a promising dental career to pursue rock and roll, devastating his parents. Brian and Roger formed Smile's core. Tim Staffell handled vocals and bass. They were good, really good, but something essential was missing. They just couldn't identify what. Tim Staffell had a friend from Ealing Art College named Freddie Bulsara. Knowing Freddie's obsession with music, Tim invited him to see Smile perform. That first concert changed everything. Freddie watched Brian's fingers move across the Red Special, producing otherworldly sounds. He watched Roger demolish his drums while hitting impossibly high harmonies. He watched Tim sing and move across the stage. And he knew with absolute certainty, I can do this better. From that night forward, Freddie became Smile's shadow. Every concert, same spot, always watching, always absorbing. Afterward, he'd slip backstage with suggestions about movement, lighting, theatricality. Brian and Roger found him equal parts amusing and irritating. This strange young man with exotic style and bold opinions telling them how to improve? Who did he think he was? But his suggestions were often eerily insightful. There was something about his vision they couldn't completely ignore. In 1969, Freddie and Roger became unlikely business partners, opening a stall at Kensington Market selling vintage clothes and Freddie's artwork. The market was a haven for London's artistic fringe musicians, artists, dreamers running from conventional lives. They spent endless hours together at the stall, talking about music, sharing dreams, becoming genuine friends. Roger would later recall they were living in each other's pockets, scraping together money just to eat. During those market days, Freddie never stopped talking about Smile's potential. He had visions of theatrical elements that could transform them from good to unforgettable. Roger found himself agreeing more often than he expected. Spring 1970 arrived with devastating news. Tim Staffell was leaving Smile to join another band called Humpy Bong. The name alone should have been a warning, but Tim was frustrated. Smile had released a single that went nowhere. Gigs were drying up. He'd had enough. Brian and Roger sat in their rehearsal space surrounded by equipment that suddenly felt pointless, wondering if this was the universe telling them to quit. Then Freddie appeared. He'd been waiting for this exact moment, possibly for years. He looked at Brian and Roger with an intensity they'd never seen from him before. "You can't give up now," he said. "I want to sing." Brian and Roger exchanged glances. The moment of truth had arrived. They'd listened to Freddie's opinions for months, but they'd never actually heard him perform. Could he back up all that confidence? Roger later admitted he was skeptical. Freddie was so theatrical, so extreme, that Roger almost laughed. Brian had similar reservations. They thought Freddie was a great showman, but singing was different. Still, they decided to give him a chance. Brian moved to the piano and played some chords. Roger picked up his drumsticks, and Freddie opened his mouth. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. The shy art student who whispered in classrooms vanished like smoke. In his place stood someone else entirely, someone larger than life, someone who commanded the room with presence that felt almost supernatural. His voice was raw, unpolished, but the power was undeniable. The way he moved, the way he held himself, the way his voice filled every corner of the space like water flooding a basement. Within seconds, Brian and Roger knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Years later, Brian would describe Freddie as having this thrusting energy and zeal for everything. Roger would say that despite his skepticism, he instantly realized Freddie possessed massive hidden talents. The audition lasted maybe 3 minutes. It was enough. Freddie Bulsara was in the band. But Freddie wasn't satisfied with simply joining. He wanted to create something entirely new. His first act was proposing a new name. Smile was fine, he said, but too ordinary. He wanted something bold, memorable, a statement before they played a single note. He suggested Queen. Brian and Roger hesitated. Too audacious? Too risky? But Freddie was insistent. Queen was simple, regal, universal. It worked in any language. People would remember it instantly. Freddie also decided to complete his own transformation. He'd been Farrokh Bulsara, then Freddie Bulsara. Now he would become someone entirely new. Taking inspiration from the Roman messenger god, he changed his surname to Mercury. Freddie Mercury was born. Queen had a singer, guitarist, and drummer, but still needed bass. Over the following months, they auditioned numerous musicians. Mike Gross joined but left after a few shows. Barry Mitchell played 13 gigs before departing. Doug Bogey lasted 2 performances. The chemistry was never right. In February 1971, they met a quiet electronics student named John Deacon at a London disco. John was different, painfully shy. He barely spoke during his audition, letting his bass do the talking. His style was understated but rock solid. His bass lines locked perfectly with Roger's drumming. More importantly, his calm presence balanced the more volatile personalities. On July 2, 1971, Queen played their first show with the classic lineup at a college outside London. The 4 musicians who would conquer the world had finally found each other. But finding each other was just the beginning. Queen still had to prove themselves. They played tiny venues to audiences of 30 or fewer. They loaded their own equipment into a van that broke down constantly. Some nights they had to choose between petrol or food. They usually chose petrol. Freddie often went to bed hungry, but he never complained, never lost faith. During this period, the 4 members developed bonds that would sustain them through decades. They weren't just bandmates, they were brothers. Looking back, what stands out most isn't the talent or the luck. It's the perseverance. Freddie Mercury spent years being rejected before anyone gave him a real chance. Brian May and Roger Taylor watched their first band collapse and had to find courage to start again. John Deacon auditioned for a group that had already burned through 3 bass players. Each could have quit, should have quit, but something inside them refused. The shy boy from Zanzibar who covered his mouth when he laughed became the most electrifying performer of his generation. The astrophysics student who built a guitar from a fireplace became one of rock's greatest guitarists. The dental student who chose drums over stability became legendary. The quiet electronics student who barely spoke at his audition became the heartbeat of one of history's greatest bands. Roger Taylor once said that nobody really knew Freddie. He was shy, gentle, kind, not the person he portrayed on stage. But perhaps that was his greatest magic, transforming all his vulnerability, all his pain, all his loneliness into something that would outlive them all. 3 minutes. That's all it took. 3 minutes for the silent boy to prove he was born to command stages. 3 minutes to change rock and roll forever.